Why should I listen to a podcast rather than radio?
Radio now is facing a challenge, and that challenge comes a lot from
How we went from radio to podcast.
everyone that listens to me feels that I talk to them as well. And that's what is missing in radio stations today. Radio is here to be there and to tell you what happens live, what happens immediately, and you're not supposed to re-listen to it. The average is around 20% of people connected to internet that are listening to podcasts, which is not that much, and use them instead of being used. When you're above the average, you start to become mature. Radio is facing a challenge and is trying to address it. Radio is not meant to be recorded. It's always the 20% that are managing. 80% of the creators, even in the States, have a hard time financing podcasts. All countries are facing the same issue with.
Philippe, can you walk me through how we went from radio to podcasts? And nowadays, why should I listen to a podcast rather than radio or vice versa? What's the story here?
I don't know if I can tell you why listening to podcasts and not to radio. What is sure and what I'm a watcher, so what I do is I watch and I listen, of course, because we're talking about audio. And what we can see is that radio now is facing a challenge, and that challenge comes a lot from podcasters that are coming now since a long time. But in France, let's say, really the new trend of podcasters came around 2016, 2017. Those are the ones that we call pioneer, which they are not really, because we have something in France called Arte Radio. And Arte Radio, it's not a radio, it's a podcast company, and they were founding 20 years ago. Doing only podcast, and that was really interesting. But what is important to say regarding that challenge is that in Canada, for instance, there's I made an interview of in Canada they have built that very smartly in 3 different areas. They have talk radio, they have music radio, and they have what they call balado. Balado, which is the only country that called podcast something else than podcast. It's called balado because the Quebec, people from Quebec are not saying email, they say courriel électronique. So they really respect a lot French, and they have a vision of podcasting which is really interesting. And they noticed that the podcasters are challenging radio stations that were producing a lot of audio content, and now there's a lot of podcasters that are creating that same audio with the same quality, even better after 4, 5, 6, 7 years of doing podcasts. They're even better than radio stations. So they're facing something which is very new is competition. They didn't have competition before, not that sort of competition, and so the public radio station managed to face it and to address it, and because they were already doing a lot of production, but all the other stations, radio station, they went on doing old-fashioned radio, and now that they see that there's a lot of people listening to podcasts, there's communities that are created around podcasting. People are creating companies producing podcasts, what we call only in English, or native podcasts as we call it in French. So there's a lot of challenge, and Radio Canada is so in Canada I made that article, and they do a very smart thing. The podcast area, the podcast that they create, never go live on the radio station, and that helped us to bring a new audience to Radio Canada that didn't know Radio Canada. They just liked the podcast. And they say, oh, who's doing that podcast? Radio. Oh, I'm going to listen to radio. And it brought them some young people towards their talk radio or their music radio. So that's kind of funny to see how it's done over there. And in France and in other countries, I think everyone, I mean, I come back from the podcast show, everyone is facing today the same problematic of financing when you're producing a podcast. This is the main issue in every country, even in UK, which is kind of mature. Now it's over. There's some studies. We Are Social and GWI made a study each year about podcasting and who between the 16 and the 66 years old people connected to internet, how many are listening to podcasts? It really differs from country to country, but UK is above the average. The average is around 20% of people connected to internet that are listening to podcasts, which is not that much if you think about it. France is 14%. Germany is just above the average. So it seems like when you're above the average, you start to become mature. So there's a lot of markets that are not mature in Europe. Maybe half of the countries are mature and half are on the way to get mature. So it's still a new trend. But yeah, radio is facing a challenge and is trying to address it. Sometimes very well, sometimes not very well. So, but the end is really the listener. I mean, the listener is the one that decides what he wants to listen, even if it's a video podcast, a radio podcast, a native podcast, a podcast first, a podcast only. I mean, it doesn't matter. What is important is you have your application mobile, because 90% of the podcasts are listen on mobile, and you just find the right content for you.
Right. Talk to me about the barrier to entry of those two very similar media at the end of the day, because it's typically something you'd consume in a similar fashion, like folding laundry, during commutes, whatever, right? Sports, you'd listen to podcasts versus radio. But talk to me about the barrier to entry to people actually producing podcasts or producing radio shows. What's the difference here? And could it be the reason that radio is facing such competition?
You mean barrier of entry in what kind of term? In terms of producing, in terms of money, in terms of...
So if today or tomorrow I want to start a show with Philippe in France called The Podcast States in France. If we want to start a podcast, to me, but I don't know everything about radio, it very much feels like it's going to be pretty easy, right? You set up your RSS feed, you design an artwork on Canva, then you and I record, we invite guests, and that's pretty much it. If we want to start a radio show in the similar fashion, it's a whole different ballgame. So could that be the reason why radio is getting so much competition and getting a bit overflown by podcast?
Well, I think one of the reasons why radio are not really adapting in all the countries, there's some really countries that are doing well with podcast and do native, podcast only. Not broadcast on air at all, and they're managing. In France, we have Energy that is doing some really original podcast or podcast only, and that work pretty well. But I think the problematic that radio station have is that they don't see yet how they can finance it, and they earn much more money selling advertising, regular advertising. Because what happens is that the agencies that are selling media today, those Publicis and Havas and all those agencies, advertising agencies that are buying, tons of media to put their advertising on, they don't identify podcast yet as a really media as radio is, and radio is considered, but only in certain categories. I mean, for cars and supermarkets, those are really identified for radio. But when it comes to other brands, they're really interested in digital, TV, in streaming. In advertising on, all the platforms that and that we all go to first, and then they say, well, we can also do radio, and in that radio space, audio starts to, to have a name, and podcast starts to bring up. But I was talking to Havas not a long time ago, and they don't even know who Acast is. Acast. They don't know who Acast is. So it's really new for agencies. So it will take time, but like all every media takes time. Podcast is really young. It's 2001. So it's only 23 years old if we can talk about that. So let's it's normal that it takes time, and I think the COVID made it increase really fast, and then we had a small decrease because people had less time. So to create a podcast today is very simple. You need to have to get the good idea, but I think the radio station has to learn also the codes of podcasting, which is more the name, intimate, and that word that everyone is using when you're talking about podcast, how intimate it is and how personal and how so yeah, it has to be like that. And it's true that radio stations are not used to that kind of thing. So usually they ask podcasters to come and help them, and that's what we see more and more. Independent podcaster that are requested to help them doing a podcast only.
Speaking of intimate media, you recently interviewed Natasha Mercure from Radio Canada, and she said something which is interesting, which is when it comes to podcasts, we're often friendlier, right? Because we have more time, we can afford to be a little bit more familiar, and the listeners respond to that. Is that something specifically that you cannot find in the radio, and in the day and age where you're just bombarded with signals, right? You have your TikTok, you have Instagram, you have your TV, you have YouTube, you have this and that. Taking the time to listen to a conversation for 45 minutes or an hour, is that what makes potentially the difference? Because radio also have to stick to an agenda, right? They have the ad breaks, they have the different shows they need to broadcast and so on and so forth. Whereas podcast is just like, hey, listen to us if you'd like, and it's just going to be a 1 hour conversation about something that we like and you might like as well.
Well, the difference is that a podcast, you decide to listen to a podcast. Radio is here to be a friend to you, but to accompany you during the day and to be with you, around you. And someone told me once, and I thought about it, and I said that is pretty true. Radio is not meant to be recorded. It's meant to entertain you. It's meant to if you have a great, big, enormous show live, like, I don't know, Eurovision or the Olympic Games. Radio is here to be there and to tell you what happens live, what happens immediately, what happens, and you're not supposed to re-listen to it. So I don't think we can compare it. If you look the core of radio, and then radio made a lot of things. I mean, we also had a long time ago some fictions in radio, stories that, like films that were just recorded in audio. But now radio is more into something that is that needs to be immediate and that needs to be big, and that there's a sense in that. That's why today a lot of radio, that we call generalist radio in France, that are talking about all kind of content and are doing are the most famous in France. Musical stations, it's harder because you have someone that tells you which song you're going to listen. The way that music is programmed at the radio station is way behind Spotify and their playlist, which is very accurate, and it comes out maybe 3 or 4 months after on the radio station. So program directors are not doing the job that they were supposed to do 40 years ago, because when they were really selecting new groups, new music, they were taking risk. Today, when you're a radio station, you don't take any risk anymore because you want to make the money you're supposed to do with the cost that you have and the margin that you were making before, which is shrinking more and more, but still doing some margin. And radio is not going bad. A lot of people are listening to radio, but it's true that the way it depends country. There are some countries in which we're still into measurements, audience monitoring. That we can talk about, but it's really, in France, for instance, we are calling people to ask them what they listen to. Is it efficient? Is it really accurate today and are we sure that we have so many people really listening to radio? When we ask all the people around us, the young people, and the fewer and fewer people are listening to radio live. They want to listen to their content, and it can be a radio program on replay. It can be also a podcast, or it can be a video on YouTube that you listen in audio because you have a YouTube Premium. So I think it's really something today that depends on how you want to consume audio.
So we're spending lots of time on radio here, but I love it because it really allows you. I mean, you're coming from a radio background, Philippe, and it also really allows you to understand, allows us to understand where is podcast coming from and what's the interaction between the two here. I have one last question for you on this, Philippe. And it's taking a bit of a tangent, but I'm interested into taking your take on it. Is video podcast gonna be the new breath for radio? And by that I mean, YouTube is becoming big on podcasts. Google is phasing out of Google Podcasts, right, to double down on YouTube Music, and they are pushing a bit more forward the ones that have video. Spotify is also allowing you to publish the video on their platform. So we really see a trend and kind of a shift towards video podcasts for the ones that can afford it, because it's a whole different level of production. Could that be the redemption of radio? Because if people start consuming their podcasts with video, they will necessarily not listen to it at the same time they will listen to a radio show, which is right now the case. How do you see the interaction between this, like radio, podcast, and the new shift towards video podcast?
Well, I think, once again, I think the one who decides is the listener. And where is the listener? And if your content is compelling, I mean, if your content is compelling and you have a lot of people listening to it, if you also have some video that you want to broadcast, if you have some moments that you can use on the social networks, I mean, everyone knows that video is more attractive to give you the idea of going to listen to or to watch a content. So of course, I think that there's no. I mean, if you have the capacity of filming your podcast, and if you don't want to use those video, it's stupid, because if you have the capacity of filming it, even if you don't want to put the whole piece of it, well, just take some small some small shorts and put them on those algorithm that today you can't control, because it's the platform that are choosing what content you're looking at. But use this capacity, and to bring people to the place you want them to go. If you want them to go to YouTube, okay, fine. But do we as podcaster? I mean, podcasters are as strong as YouTube today. Why? Because we don't depend on algorithm. We don't depend on only one Google, or only on Google. We're you have your RSS feed, and you can do exactly what you want with your content and bring it to all the people you want. Do we want everything to go through YouTube and Google? That's also a question of choice that you have to make as a content creator. And I don't think so. I think it's really important that we keep that autonomy of datas with RSS feed, which is going to evolve and is evolving now, which is really all the core of your business, because you're owning your datas, you're owning your piece of audio. If you put it on any other platform, on YouTube or Spotify in video, you don't control it anymore. They're selling advertising on you. They are making business on you. So I think you have to use it. If you can film your podcast, do it. But of course, it requests a lot of more time, more people working on it, and when you know how hard it is to make a podcast and to hold it every week. But if you manage to do it, of course, do it. I mean, a lot of podcasters now realize that it goes much better when they film their podcast. Once again, what is important at the end is that you respect the listener. If you're making a podcast and it's a video podcast, and I listened to a podcast not a long time ago that was filmed, and he was saying things, but we didn't see it because we didn't listen to what he was saying. He was showing something as it was filmed, but the listeners were taken apart because we were not seeing what he was explaining. So you have to make the podcast as a podcast and don't think that there's cameras, because then if you think that there are cameras, it's a video, you know, and you the way you describe things, the way you talk to the person is because you have cameras, and that's really important if you want to address listeners. Make your content and create and produce your content as an audio content. And if there's cameras, then okay, you can then use those videos to attract the people to where you want them to go. If it's YouTube because you're a YouTuber and you're born with YouTube, do that. I mean, there's nothing wrong. And if you want to also take your audio and put it on our RSS feed, do it as well. I mean, this is important to be able to be found in a platform. And what we can say to finish is, like, YouTube is the second search engine. So when a young person is looking for a content, if he doesn't find you on YouTube, well, he won't necessarily go to Apple Podcast or Spotify to find you.
I love that. You've mentioned something a couple of times in this episode, Philippe, which is native podcasts. Can you maybe quickly offer us a definition of that? Because I think that's a very French term.
Yeah, it's the French cultural exception. The native podcast. Native podcast is podcast only. It's original podcast. It comes from all those independent producers, the indies, that need to make people understand that the podcasts that are made and produced in radio stations are not the same, are not done the same way, because it's done in a radio style. Even if some radio stations are doing also native podcast and are producing it as a real podcast, but they want to differentiate their podcast, because today radio stations have a communication power which is very important, and people are listening, but they're also, you see that they're communicating on the word podcast for content that is, as James Corden says, reheated. It's réchauffé, which means that it's a show that doesn't request any more work than just cut it and put it onto our RSS feed. While native podcast, we can call it's like a movie. In the cinema, a movie is produced. So as soon as a content is produced and is not broadcasted on a radio or somewhere else on YouTube, we call it a native podcast, so that we know that it's nowhere else. But that's typical French, and I think it's going to fade away. I was talking, through Benjamin Bellamine from Castopod. I was talking. He made the interview with Adam Curry, the creator of the RSS, and we asked if we could add a tag in the RSS, the evolution of our RSS 2.0. If we could add a tag which is native podcast or a replay podcast, and the answer was really clear. Is like, there's no difference. I mean, what's the difference between a podcast that comes from YouTube and a podcast that comes from a radio station, or a podcast that is native? Once again, it's the listener that will make the difference. So in France, we like to have native podcasts to say that we are part of those original podcasts that no one else can do. But really, it's a period, I think, and this will fade away in a couple of years.
So if I understand properly, it was also a way to make the difference. I mean, it is a way to make the difference, in France at least, between a podcast that has been produced solely for the podcast purpose versus maybe a radio show that has been transformed into a podcast episode and broadcasted on podcast format. Is that what
Well, it can be also many. I mean, Hugo Decrypt, which has a YouTube channel, and then take the audio and put it on the podcast is a replay.
Right. Okay.
It's not called a native podcast because it has been broadcast somewhere else than only in audio.
Okay. But so why are we making the difference in France about that? Because indeed, I'm like, yeah, okay, but that's probably just a podcast. If I take, we are big on the US market, and so we see the way it's done there, and there are plenty of things that are just transformed from video to podcast as well.
I think it's a good. Yeah, it's a cultural way. I mean, in the States, we had it was existing syndication of programs, and you had producers, and you have a lot of actors in radio station that are producing content. They are not employed by the radio station. They are just producing. In the States, you had a lot of people producing their content and broadcasting in different. In one station in every state. So they have a mentality of producing shows differently than in France. In France, we produce a show only for a station, and no one says that it's not the radio station that produces. It's the brand of the station. They have maybe 20 producers for all their shows, but it's the radio station that is named, that is branded. In the States, it's different. So I think there's that also a way of doing with programming, and then from those syndication they went to XM Sirius on the satellite, and then they went off the satellite and become a podcast, only podcast, not even broadcasting on radio station. So I think for them it's really natural. In France, we never have had that kind of thing. So. Native podcasts are today independent producer or companies that are producing those podcasts and are not into the radio environment. There's a fight. They're looking at each other, not talking to each other in France, which is the podcaster says, "Well, the radio station they don't want to they're not interested in me," and the radio stations are saying, "Well, we're not interested in native podcasts because they're just doing some small audio like that." And they're not curious. Radio stations are not curious, are not listening to what the podcast independent are really doing. And they should, because they could help each other. They could promote each other. They could work as it was in the States. And it starts to be like that. But it's very, very few stations that are really interested in the work that the native podcasts are doing. So I think, once again, I think it will fade away, but today it's important for them to be recognized as native podcast.
I was listening to an interview of Gary Vaynerchuk on the Modern Wisdoms podcast, and he was explaining how we entered into a meritocratic era of social media, meaning the moms and pop shop can just start a TikTok channel, and if they are doing good work, like they put in the work for the quantity and the quality, they can reach millions of views very, very fast. Whereas the big accounts with lots of followers, especially on Instagram, for instance, weren't getting that much traction anymore, because before you could expect, okay, I have that many followers, 10 to 15% of those followers will see any new post that I publish. And so he talks about the end of the followers era. Can you talk to me about that specific aspect for podcasts? Is it something we see as well in the media in general? And how does that impact the radio and the podcast format in your opinion, Philippe?
Well, I think it's the end of the followers. And that it's not for me. I listened to a podcast called Silicon Carne from Carlos Diaz, who's in the Silicon Valley. It's a French podcast talking about all that happens within the Silicon Valley, and he talked about the CEO of Jack Conte, the CEO of Patreon, and he made a presentation about the end of followers, and I was really it's now maybe 6 months that I see how the social networks and how hard it is for the content creator, for the creator economy to really earn as much money as they were doing before on all the platforms. And that's all that is because of TikTok and of this algorithm that they are imposing to all of us, and who oblige a content creator to give more and give more and give more content to maybe have the chance of being in the algorithm of people that normally follows you, but they can't follow you because it's the platform that tells you what you have, what you will look at. And that's not the case with YouTube until the Reels and the Shorts came, because they copied what TikTok did. But on YouTube, you could subscribe, and then you got an email, and you knew that when you published a video, at least your followers will see you, and you could make a business out of it. Today, I made an interview on Podcast Magazine with Fabien Olicard, who is a famous mentalist in France, and Fabien was the first also to tell me that he was horrified because before he could count on his followers, and today on TikTok he doesn't understand. Sometimes there's a video he's posting and there's no one, no views, and he sees someone that has 6 followers that makes millions of views. So he says we can't count on that anymore. So I feel that now really the game is changing, and what is important is to be able to have true fans, and true fans are people that you can gather into a safe environment, which is not depending on those algorithms that is horribly getting us attached to our phone all the time. And I'm the first one to be attached to my phone, and I say to my kids, don't be attached, but I am attached myself, because they know exactly what content is compelling for you and what you're going to like, because they have all the data of your mobile phone. They know that you went there and your interest is there, and you have a Toyota, because they know everything about you thanks to your mobile and your email and all those data. So they know exactly what kind of content you want, depending on the life you have, and they have the experience of that. So all that, to get rid of that, is either you cut your phone and you go into a hotel that is without connection, the right to be disconnected, and that's more and more places are like that, and I can tell you that I do that one month in the summer, and in summer, August, I just cut every connection. I'm not connected to my phone. I cut my phone. I cut my social network. I cut everything during 1 month, and it's you're breathing, really. You're breathing, because it's really something that is now harder and harder, and you have to give to feed the monster, and feed the monster is the most horrible things I've ever heard. So I think now there's a generation of creators that understood that, and so Patreon made some advertising for themselves, because that's how they want that platform to evaluate and to go to go to. But I really believe that this is the right way to go. Go to some safe places where you can gather your fans, whether you make them pay or not. It doesn't matter, because on Patreon you can have a lot of content without free. They can access it for free, but you gather them and you tell them that this is the place where you can really follow us. And when no one will tell you, here is some advertising, here is some, and if you want to pay if you want to help me with some regular money, or if you want to pay for something that I propose to you, an ebook or some webinars or some masterclass, well, you can do it, because that's how I can manage to go on if you like what I'm telling you. So I think this is really some secure place that we need to create now as content creators, and to use those platforms for what they're for, which is you have to know that they're making business out of you. So you have to turn around, make business out of the platform, and use them instead of being used.
I love that. I guess that also answers to the question that I had for you afterwards, which is, how do you build a community that converts? Because I'm all for, putting content out there, sharing knowledge, broadcasting, whatever you have to broadcast, right? If you have something to say, it's probably worthwhile, because there will be people listening. But then there is also the aspect of, hey, okay, this is time invested. There are some setup to be bought. There is like a whole distribution, production, whatsoever. So how do you actually build those communities that eventually convert in a win-win situation? Because you don't want them to just be paying you. Those platforms are a good option for that. I mean, if I'm a TikToker and I publish a video that every week gets to the high millions of views, that can be seriously interesting money. So how do you do that when you have a podcast specifically? And do you see this applied as well to radio, or is radio still in the kind of advertising business anyways?
Yeah, well, I think radio has to change to start with that. I mean, the core of radio at the start in the 80s, when it got liberated in France and in other countries, was I want to be close to the person who listens to me. And it was some incredible shows at that time when there was a liberation that we found again a bit during the COVID. I mean, radio station changed totally their way of doing because they were doing it from home. And it was much more personal than it ever been before for the last 30 years. Because in the 80s, it was really crazy. You were really getting a feeling of you want to listen to that station. It's your friend that talks. But to go back to the question regarding how you do, well, I have a question to you, Guillaume. How do you make if you want to have a friend?
I don't know. I guess I go to...
What's the work? I mean,
yeah.
If you want to have someone that is really a friend to you, how are you doing it? And that's exactly the same way for your listeners. You want them, it's not you want them to be friend with you, is you want to be friend with them. And when you want to be friend with them, you're doing the right things. So if you want to go on holiday with them, you're sharing maybe the money. And maybe, maybe they invite you one day and then you invite them. So and you're not passing three months without telling them, hey, can we talk or can we have a drink? No, you're doing it on a regular basis because you like them. So it's exactly the same way for a podcast or a content creator, but podcast is really much more simple because you're talking into the ears of that person. And if you really do that, if you really think that I'm talking to you, Guillaume, but everyone that listens to me feels that I talk to them as well. And that's what is missing in radio stations today. Presenters are talking to everyone, but that's also where it's the core of radio to talk to everyone and to entertain everyone and to be just there to entertain. So it will never die. Radio will never die. Entertainment will never die. But people are consuming content as they want to have it. And today, what people need is to have confidence, to have friends, is to know that you can learn something interesting things with people that you like their voice, you like their way of putting things, you like their way of giving you things, and then you give them in return. And if you try to do that with your listener, if you try to be, if you want to be friend with them, it's not you want them to be friend with you, because then it's the it's the way around. And all the podcasters that have that really want to be friend with their listeners, that works. But it's not something that you create. You have it or you don't have it. If you want them to be friend to you, usually it doesn't work. So it really comes from the host and from the hostess and saying and that's why most of those that are succeeding in podcasts are the more passionate, are people that have a strong interest, a strong passion, and really want to talk and to have a lot of friends that listen to them. And then the secrets, I mean, there's all the secrets. Of course, we can talk about buying some, at the podcast show, it was some companies, they were not saying it, but they were selling you some 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 plays on your podcast. So you can easily end with true, virtual profiles, of people that are, in most of the platform, between 20 and 40% are virtual profiles from AI now. AI is creating profiles and is helping them to build some audience and you can buy that as you could buy before, friends on Instagram, likes, or you could buy that and you still can do that. But now they do that also for podcasting. But this is of course a way to sell more advertising, but it's the opposite of what podcasting is and of what you have to do to create a real strong relation with the person that is listening to you. So it's the regularity, which I am very bad at. It's wanting to have your listeners as friends, and is to making everything possible so that you go on with that relation. And the day you don't want, well, you stop your podcast, and if you're not like that, it's going to be harder. It's not impossible, but it's going to be harder. So, and then a last thing is that I don't think success in podcasts is a word we can use. Because everyone says, wow, your podcast is just such a success. What is success, And what is really, if you're doing a podcast for a small community, and you know that, if I do a podcast for the community of radio professionals in France, it's 15,000 people. So I know that I can't go over that. I know that no one would be interested in, we have a website called lettre.pro, which is a French. We know that we're not going to go above the audience we have today. What we want is we want them to know that we're still here for them and we'll still take them as friends, so we go on informing them about what happens in their business. And that's enough. If you have 1,000 people around your bakery or around your shop in your small city and you're addressing them, that's a success. If you manage to have 800 of them. If I manage today and to gather every month 10,000 of my 15,000, I'm a success. So I think success is really different from what you see it and what you can imagine it is. So when I hear people saying, hey, wow, this is a real success, okay, but compared to what? Because that's really the core thing. So if it's a success, and then there's some successes that doesn't have any audience, if you want to call it that makes a lot of money, but they don't have any audience, and they manage to do podcasts. So it's basically podcast for egos. There's a lot of brands that have egos, and they do their podcast. There's no listener. They're happy. They have maybe 30, 40 people, but they don't care. They have their podcast, and that's a success because you're earning a lot of money doing that podcast, and there's some people that are specialized in that, in making podcasts to bring the ego and to show the right people around the person that has the ego that he has his podcast. So it's once again, it's a success, but for 25 people, and mostly the one that are invited in the shows. So and that's a success as well. So depending what you call success. For me, success is that you enjoy what you're doing it. You avoid the pot fade, the fact that you're tired of posting content. If you're tired of posting content, ask yourself questions. And that's what is the most important. And that's what I like in podcasting is like you have so many different profiles of independent makers, independent creators, people that never touched to audio before. In France, we have almost 90% of the podcasters that are not coming from the audio industry, that are not coming from radio, or that are not coming from production. And this is great because it's so transversal. It's you have so many in every core of craft. You have people making podcasts, and you discover people that have success in their own environment that you never knew before because you were not in that environment. For chemist, for a dentist, there's two guys here. He's a osteopath. I don't know how you call it. I don't know how you call it in English. He cracks your back and all that. And he's creating a podcast for chiropractors for chiropractors that wants to become independent, and it's a hell in front, and he's making a podcast for that, and he's going to have some success because he's targeting a certain type of people.
Man, so many golden nuggets in this, and definitely revealing some industry secrets. But that's very good. Do you see differences between, and you've been moderating panel around this, Philippe, so I think you'll do what to talk to. Do you see differences between podcasting in Europe versus the rest of the world? That how is seen the podcasting sphere in Europe versus, I don't know, anywhere else?
I think that, as I said before, with the average of people listening to podcasts, I think podcasting is almost the same in every country in Europe. When it starts, you have 80% of independent makers and then 20% of production company, and then it turns around. You have 80% of podcasts that are made by production company, and 20% of independent podcasters that are really staying as podcaster, and that takes a different evolution depending on the country and depending on the amount of people that are listening to. And so I think today what is sure out of what I've looked at and experienced is that all countries are facing the same issue with financing podcast. You have some people that are managing to earn money, but that's 20% that are managing. It's always the 80-20. 80% of the creators, even in the States, have a hard time financing podcasts. So, and that's it's going to be, I think, forever like that, because of what I was telling you right before. Depends on what you call the success, and people have different targets, but and very little shows are international. So it's very language-oriented podcasting, because if you're making a podcast in Spanish, Spanish, you have all the South America, which is really strong. In UK, you have, of course, the English language. But we noticed that American podcast and English podcast are two different markets. Because they don't have the same accent, they don't address the same people. So we can say that really the markets are language or even accent oriented. I mean, Quebec podcast, which is French, but it's a specific market. It's not podcast that French people will listen to. Maybe a few percentage will listen, but very little are listening to that, and it's French. So and it would be the same if a country, a French talking country in Africa will launch podcasts. I think it's always for a target which you are in your language or in your accent way of talking. So it's really it's such an audio thing that you want to feel safe. You want to feel. And of course, you can have friends that are Canadian, that are from Quebec. You can have friends that are from English, from UK, and you listen to that. But the core of what you like is what looks like you, which is the French for French, the Quebec for Quebec, the UK accent, and way of talking compared to American language. So, but if you look at all the podcasts, successes are never really international. There's a few exceptions, of course. Joe Rogan, because everyone talks about it, and Serial, because everyone talks about it. So, but it's exceptions, So, I think the podcast industry looks almost the same everywhere, with some countries that are more advanced because they have more listeners. So it's really how podcast is adopted in the countries, and how podcast, in France, no one is talking about podcast. I mean, no newspaper. They're talking about their own podcast. When, magazines are launching podcasts, they're talking about their own podcast, but very little about other podcasts. And it's very hard to find today podcast. I mean, curation in podcast is barely not existing in any country, and it's not the platforms that are doing a great job out of it. they're doing what they can, but there are usually very few in the platform on the podcast side. So to make curation is basically very hard, and there's no platform today making curation. We are doing a little with Podcast Magazine, and there's some other website in France that are doing it, and in some other countries that are doing curation to help you find, but it's it's not famous. So we need in each market need to have a podcast star as Serial or as Joe Rogan to be able to have the market really explode and say and tell everyone, hey, listen to podcasts because it's something that is really different to what you've been listening before.
I absolutely love that. Philippe, you mentioned it a couple of times now. So can you tell us a bit more about Podcast Magazine? What is that? And maybe prepare in some RedTech Pro as well. What are you doing exactly in the sphere?
Our goal, once again, is my goal is to watch. So that's now 23 years I'm in the audio business. I was tennis coach before, so it has nothing to do with that. But I fell into that with my father, and I followed to work with him in the year 2001. And we create the company, and then I watched a lot all technologies, streaming, and then podcasting very, very early in 2004-5. I was looking at RSS. So I've always been interested in technologies, and Podcast Magazine is the following up of a small magazine called Le Pod. Le Pod was created in 2019 out of an idea that Acast gave us because it was existing a small magazine in UK called Pod Bible. And Pod Bible had a small A6 magazine, and we've done A6 magazine before with Télérama and a guide for radio station in Télérama. And I said, well, that could be an idea to launch a small magazine. So we launched a small magazine called The Pod. And then after a period of time, it was too small. So we wanted to have a magazine, and I wanted to understand who were those people that were making podcasts? Where did they come from? Why did they go away from radio to start a podcast? Why from any kind of craft you're starting a podcast? You're in the sport business. You're in the any people doing podcasts was interesting for me because. When you're in a radio sphere or in an industry, you're talking to each other. You know each other. And there, all the people that were doing podcasts, I did not know them. I didn't know who they were and why they were doing that. So my idea was to say, let's go and meet them. Let's go and try to understand who are those people so that I can watch better, so I can see better what happens in the industries today. And that's why I created Podcast Magazine. And Podcast Magazine is a crazy idea, something you shouldn't do in terms of marketing, because I'm targeting aficionados, people that likes podcast. I'm targeting people that want to start podcast. I'm targeting those who have a podcast and many episodes, and I'm targeting the professional. So I have a so wide, the target, and that people say you're crazy because I'm interested only in 30-40% of the magazine. But that's what I wanted to do because this is how looks podcast today in France. So it's in French. It's a French magazine that is 196 pages. We have three editions right now, and the fourth is going to come out in the end of the year. My idea was to go on stands and to go out in the kiosk and all that, but when I knew that 70% of the unsold magazine were destroyed, I decided not to go in kiosk and in stands because I think this is just crazy how press is working today. So I only sell to those who are going to podcastmagazine.fr and are speaking French or interested in the French and addressing that. So Podcast Magazine is really my way of watching. As simple as that. It's a very small team. As we're in publications and publishing, it's kind of easy for us to do. The business model was kind of hard at the beginning because podcasters don't have a lot of money Even 20 euros is a lot of money for most of them. But it's used as a tool, as when you love podcasts, I think you find always something interesting in Podcast Magazine. So that's why I created it. And then RedTech International is a company that we created during the COVID with Margaret Clark, a former professional in radio as well. And we are addressing the whole world, the 5 continents, trying to understand also what happens in the audio space regarding radio stations that are moving towards digital, how they adapt podcasting as well, and what is the role of podcasting in their business today. And this gives us also a way of watch, but really between people from Malaysia, from India, from South Africa, from the States, from Norway, from Finland, from Mexico and Spain, and all those people, we gather them. It's going to be in 2 weeks. We gather them in Lisbon in 2 weeks for a RedTech Summit. 50 people blocked into a hotel for 3 days, and we do a think tank. It's not recorded. It's not filmed. We only talk about how we see the evolution of the audio landscape and how we can address the problematic. And we have facilitators, we have partners coming in, not to show their brands, just to give some great ideas to go home with.
Absolutely love that. Philippe, I have 2 questions to finalize this interview. The first one is, what do you listen to on your free time? Are you more radio or are you more podcast?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to disappoint you.
No.
Yeah, I'm going to disappoint you. No, I love silence. So this is crazy for, sorry that, yeah, that's my little thing. I love silence. I'm able to, I'm living in the center of France, and I travel to in car a lot, and I'm able to pass 4.5 hours to go to Paris without any music or any sound. I think this is also something that gives me some breathing from my work, where I am, of course, not obliged, but I like to. But this is my work, to listen to podcasts and to see all that happens in the social networks, and to be horrified by what happens on LinkedIn, and which was for me still the place where professional could be kind of free and feel that you could share some things. Now it's horrible. I just it's a Facebook. It becomes a Facebook, and this is sad. This is sad. But so I'm I go away from that because I'm 53, and when you're 53, and I lost my mom, I lost my father. So I don't want to lose my time with people that always put themselves first. And I prefer to maybe make a podcast later on. I don't know, but I don't listen to a lot of content when I'm not working. I'm more a silence guy.
Wow, that's not the answer I was expecting, indeed. Because then the second question is 3 podcasts that you would recommend yourself because you're listening to them. But then you're gonna be able to.
Yeah, well, I have. Yeah, there's one, but it's a French podcast, so I can give the French podcast. But there's 2 French podcasts that really I like because they're really giving me two different things. The first podcast is Cerno, CERNO. It's a guy that worked for France Inter before, for a radio station in France, and who's doing a podcast. He was living in an apartment in Paris, and heard that in this apartment a serial killer was living before. So he said, "Oh, which kind of serial killer?" And he was the biggest serial killer in France that killed more than 25 old ladies in the 80s. And he started to make a podcast out of it. So he made podcast before called Superhero, and now he's making that podcast. That's more than 3 years. He's going on with his story, interviewing people to redo the whole thing about those serial killers. One of them died, the other is still alive, and then he's following all those ladies that died, going on the places, interviewing people, asking them about their life. So it's a documentary. At the same time, you follow the story with him. And it's incredible how he's making you interact. And he's got a Patreon where he has maybe 1,300 people paying each month, so that he goes on between 5 and 15 euros. He's got a Slack where he's meeting people, and he's got some meetings every month. Last Friday in Paris, to meet the people that are paying him the most, to help him in his quest. And we don't know when he's going to stop. He says, "This is my life. I'm going to go till I die." He's going to be like Molière. He's going to die on his podcast. So it's really interesting podcast to follow. And then another one that I listen to in French, and then I can give you some in English. But it's the one that I listen to is Carlos Diaz, the one I was talking. Silicon Carne. It's fresh. It's interesting. They're talking about really the latest trends in that happens in and with very interesting people that are coming to the show. And he's very into the Web3. He created a platform called Uncut.fm, which is interesting to monetize your podcast. But it's Web3 and it's still hard to adopt when you're a listener. But it's really interesting everything he's doing. And then of course, but now I listen to Podcast Guru, and thanks to Podcast Guru, I met Stefan Shefford. Stefan Shefford from Adam Shefford from the British Podcast Awards. And I met him at a podcast show thanks to your podcast. So you see, Podcast Guru is now one of my on my podcast that I listen regularly, and Pod News, of course, because James Cridlon is someone that I knew before in the radio environment. He is still a radio futurologist, and now he's a podcast futurologist as well, saying what he thinks, and that's what I like. Is like he's not scared about talking about Google and wrong decision of Spotify or YouTube, and this is really refreshing as well. And then one last a French company that make podcasts in English that I really like. I forgot about that. Engle, E-N-G-L-E, is a production company of podcasts, and there's one podcast that you must listen to. It's The Undersiders. The Undersiders, and you have it in French and in English. But basically, if you go in the Angle, you put Angle, E-N-G-J-L-E, podcast on the web, you will find their website. It's in English. You have a lot of podcasts in English, some are in French, but all the podcasts that they're making are incredible. But The Undersiders is something, if you like, I mean, I'm not a fan of pop music, but it's how pop music and drug made some deals in the States, and how everything happened really there. It's really well done, a voice that is incredible, and they're really paying attention to all details in their podcast. So it's really nice podcast you can listen to. So it's not 3, it's 5. Sorry about that.
Please, that's absolutely perfect. I love the artwork of The Undersiders. It's so it's a music note on a music grid, with the music note being that seems to be banknotes, and the music grid is made out of what seems to be cocaine lines. So I'm gonna enjoy listening to those 9 episodes. That definitely looks cool.
Yeah, it's short, and it's very very nice, and for every age actually.
Philippe Chapot, ladies and gentlemen. Philippe, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for inviting. It was nice.